Well, joining us now to discuss that particular treaty, I'm sure you must have seen it in the introduction there, is Professor Kenneth Amaeshi, who is Chair in Business and Sustainable Development, University of Edinburgh Business School. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Well, yes, President Muhammadu Buhari is back to work, and we can see that he seems to be giving fillip to one of the cardinal points upon which he was elected, the fight against corruption. He signed an extradition treaty with the United Arab Emirates and other pacts which he signed there to give, bite to this fight against corruption. What are your thoughts, on the pact that have been signed?
To a large extent, I think it's something positive and something to be celebrated one way or the other. Because for a government that positions anti-corruption as one of its key goals, so it is a positive vibe, so to speak. Overall, I think the issue will be also in terms of how some of these agreements are implemented, because Nigeria, we are not short of laws and regulations, but at the end of the day, it still boils down to implementation. So to what extent would these agreements be implemented, and to what extent can they also fulfill what we expect them to do? To
what extent should we be expecting that the agreements will be implemented?
I think it's still up in the air. I mean, if you look at other pacts we have with other countries, to a large extent, you would tend to think that we tend to get justice more outside the country. And it also depends on to what extent we believe that our legal system, the judiciary in itself, will be able to deliver. So it's not just a function of having this agreement, but also thinking through to think about how our institutions will be able to cope and sustain what has been done. So I think it's a two-way thing. So when we have this agreement, we're also thinking backwards or inwards to think about how our institutions, especially the judiciary, will be able to deliver. And we had cases where we thought we found justice more outside than internally. So I think it's a question of also to what extent people would trust that our internal institutions will be able to cope when these people are extradited back to Nigeria.
It's really very important. I mean, that's a very important angle you've raised there, considering the fact that even now, quite a number of people believe that, part of the accusations against this administration is that the war is partisan. When you are friends with the party in government, oftentimes you're allowed to get away, with things that you might face justice for abroad. So we did see, for instance, even though there are questions to that, how, Mr. Onanefe Ibori was cleared here in Nigeria and, went to the UAE, was extradited to the United Kingdom and faced justice there. And then now, people will raise questions like that. But then we also find the situation, because some people who also fear that they might not get justice if they're brought back forcefully from these countries, extradited from these countries back to Nigeria. They fear a certain persecution. So these are valid fears, aren't they?
Yeah, to an extent. I think if I start from the ordering, where the first one was about the partisan approach. Mm-hmm. Although some people may want to see it that way, but I think it's also a selfish framing of the agenda, in the sense that sometimes when something doesn't favor us, we tend to frame it in a particular way. So for me, the primary question will be, are these people culpable or not? So if they've committed any crime in terms of corruption, so irrespective of party, I would like to see it from that perspective. So whether they belong to one party or the other doesn't necessarily matter. I think it's a frame that helps some people to key into it in a particular way, especially if they see themselves on the other side of the government, where they think a particular party is been persecuting the other part. So I wouldn't see it from a partisan perspective at all. I would look at the issue on hand and say, are these people culpable? Have they committed anything that would warrant them to be investigated?
Is there merit to the case or not?
Yes, I mean, that's where I would look at it first of all, before we go back to the idea of whether the person belongs to a particular party or not. But the other side of the question, which is around the institution, to what extent should we trust that these institutions will be able to deliver, I think is a critical question. And there is also a tendency that when people come into the country to face justice, because our legal institutions are not as strong as you want them to be, and sometimes also people tend to lose our trust, and people also erroneously or otherwise believe that you can buy justice. And these are critical questions that will need to be answered or addressed before we can rely on anything to do with extradition or finding justice in the country. And these are very pertinent questions and shouldn't be taken for granted, whether it is from a partisan perspective or not. As long as we have strong institutions, these institutions should be able to deliver justice irrespective of the parties involved.
You have some people who raise questions as to, whether or not we are approaching this fight against corruption in the right manner, that we seem to be concerned about people who have stolen money and, concerned about getting those monies back, which they say is good, but then it doesn't look like we're paying attention to the system which enabled them to get away with so much money in the very first instance. Do you agree with them?
Yeah, to an extent I do. But there's something about corruption which needs to be understood. Corruption is a culture. And if you want to engage in culture change, there are two sides to it. So you can take a culture as an iceberg. So you see the visible part of culture in terms of the behavior, the mannerism, the dressing, and the likes. So that would be the top part of the iceberg. But underneath, you have values and orientations. And if we're not touching on these values and orientation, what happens is that the visible side of it changes. So corruption can quickly go underground. Corruption can quickly manifest in other ways. So instead of people asking for money across the table, you may see the money flowing under the table. So what is happening is that people are beginning to change their strategies, change their behaviors to adjust to the visibility of some of these actions, either by the government or the supporters of the people supporting the government to promote their anti-corruption agenda. So to a large extent, if you look at it from that cultural perspective, what I don't see happening is that change in orientation. This change in orientation has to do with the mindset. So if I encounter the police, what do I do? If I encounter the justice system, what do I do? If I go to a public office, what do I do? So as long as these things are still there, one way or the other, even to the extent that if people talk about examination malpractices, So these are different manifestations of corruption in different ways. And if you even push it further down, you can also talk about what you may call institutionalized corruption. So if you look at how Nigeria is currently structured, and people are talking about restructuring, so depending on how much you want to stretch it, you can find also that there is kind of corruption embedded in the structure of Nigeria. So these things will need to change to accommodate that orientation and that mindset to also correspond. So to an extent, I would say, yes, the visible aspects are good, but how far they can go will be dependent on how much we're also able to change the orientation underneath.